Here's a number that should stop you cold. 27 films, nearly 3 decades of releases. A studio that has never, not once, released a movie that actually lost money at the box office. Not during recessions, not during a pandemic, not even when the movie was about a rat who wanted to cook French food. Every other major studio has a graveyard. Pixar has a winning streak. And the craziest part is how close they came to ending it, twice within 2 years of each other. Hi, my name is Bernard, and this is Frame Theory, Toy Story. 1995. Let's go back to 1995. Computer animation at this point is basically a parlor trick. Studios are using it for special effects, backgrounds, maybe a crowd scene here and there. Nobody, and I mean nobody, is making a full-length feature film out of it. Nobody except a small operation in Point Richmond, California, with about 300 employees and a CEO named Steve Jobs, who had just personally bankrolled the whole thing to the tune of $50 million after buying the company from George Lucas for $10 million in 1986. Disney was involved, but not in the way people remember. Disney had distribution rights and creative approval. They could greenlight or kill the whole project. And at one point in 1993, they did. Disney's Jeffrey Katzenberg looked at an early cut and told Pixar the characters were unwatchable, too edgy, too mean. They shelved it, and Pixar basically had 4 months of money left before they would have had to shut down entirely. They rebuilt it. Softer, warmer, more heart. And on November 22nd, 1995, Toy Story opened in theaters with a $30 million budget and walked out with $373 million worldwide. The first fully computer-animated feature film in history didn't just make money, it made history. And it made Disney look very closely at the little company they'd been keeping at arm's length. A Bug's Life, 1998. The follow-up was always going to be tricky. After Toy Story, everyone was watching, and what made it trickier was DreamWorks. Jeffrey Katzenberg, the same guy who told Pixar their movie was garbage, had left Disney, started DreamWorks, and rushed out a movie called Ants, specifically to beat A Bug's Life to theaters. He had heard about Pixar's Ant project through the industry grapevine, and basically sprinted a competing film into production. Ants came out 6 weeks before A Bug's Life. There was genuine industry gossip about which one would win. The answer was both of them, but one more than the other. A Bug's Life cost $45 million and made $363 million worldwide. Ants made $172 million on a $60 million budget. A Bug's Life won. Quietly, without anyone really throwing a parade. It never gets the credit it deserves, and honestly, if you haven't watched it recently, go back and watch it. It holds up better than people give it credit for. That's my aside for this chapter, and I'm standing by it. Toy Story 2, 1999. This one should not exist, or at least, it should not exist in the form that it does, because Toy Story 2 started life as a direct-to-video project. Disney wanted a cheap sequel to cash in on the first film. No theatrical release, smaller budget, smaller ambitions. Pixar pushed back. Hard. They wanted it in theaters or not at all. Disney eventually agreed, which meant the budget went up and the pressure went up with it. And then, about 9 months before release, someone at Pixar accidentally ran a file deletion script on the production servers. When 90% of the film was gone in 90 seconds, the backup system had failed. The only reason Toy Story 2 survived is that one of the supervising technical directors had a copy on her home computer, because she'd been working from home after having a baby. The movie was saved by a laptop and a new mother. That's the actual story. $90 million in budget. $485 million worldwide. Best reviewed Pixar sequel until Toy Story 3 came along, and it got there by almost being deleted off the face of the earth. Monsters, Inc. and Finding Nemo, 2001 and 2003. By 2001, Pixar has a 3-film win streak and a lot of creative confidence. Monsters, Inc. is the first time they really lean into world building as a primary feature. The whole premise, that monsters are scared of children, not the other way around, is clever enough that it almost writes itself. But what makes it land is Sully and Mike. The emotional core is the relationship. And Pixar already knew by this point that's what sells. Budget was $115 million. Worldwide gross, $577 million. Another home run. Then, Finding Nemo. 260 million domestic, 867 million worldwide. On a $94 million budget, the film became the best-selling DVD of all time, which in 2003 meant something enormous. It was everywhere. Every house with a child under 10 had a copy, multiple copies that got scratched and had to be replaced. Finding Nemo also did something very specific for Pixar's business model. It proved that an original property, not a sequel, not an adaptation, could carry a franchise on its own. The clownfish nobody asked for turned into one of the most valuable animated IP addresses of the decade. The Incredibles and Cars, 2004 and 2006 Brad Bird, walked into Pixar in 2004 carrying the Iron Giant on his back. That film, which he'd directed for Warner Brothers in 1999, was a genuinely great movie that bombed catastrophically at the box office because of a marketing disaster. So legendary it still gets discussed in film school case studies. Warner Brothers forgot to market it. I'm not being glib, they just didn't really promote it. It made $8 million on a $70 million budget. So Bird shows up at Pixar with something to prove, and he pitches a superhero family film at a time when superhero movies were not yet the dominant cultural force they had become. The Incredibles cost $92 million and made $631 million worldwide. It also won the Oscar for Best Animated Feature and is still, and I will die on this hill, one of the best superhero films ever made, animated or otherwise. Then Cars. Critics were lukewarm. Some people found it slow. The story about a hotshot race car learning humility in a forgotten desert town didn't have the same emotional gut punch as what came before it. Reviews were solid, but not effusive. It made $462 million worldwide on a $120 million budget. Very fine. But here's the thing about Cars that has nothing to do with the movie itself. The merchandise. Toys, clothes, bedding, backpacks, lunchboxes, branded macaroni, and cheese. The Cars franchise generated more than $10 billion in merchandise revenue over the following decade. $10 billion. The movie is essentially a very expensive toy commercial that also happens to be a decent film. Ratatouille, 2007. At some point in development, the director of Ratatouille changed. Jean Pincava, who had the original concept, was replaced by Brad Bird midway through production. This happens sometimes in animation. It's a sign of trouble. When a director gets replaced that late, it usually means the movie is in danger of not working at all. Bird came in, reworked the story, kept the core idea, and made it his own. A rat who wants to cook in a Paris restaurant is the kind of premise that sounds like a 3-sentence pitch someone made as a joke. And yet, Ratatouille was maybe the most technically accomplished Pixar film ever made. The food looks so real, it almost becomes uncomfortable. The kitchen sequences have a physicality that still impresses animators today. Budget was $150 million. Worldwide gross, $623 million. Another win. And it won the Oscar for Best Animated Feature. Ratatouille is one of those films that quietly became a classic while nobody was fighting about it on the internet. Wall-E and Up, 2008 and 2009. These two came out back to back, and together they represent something close to Pixar's creative ceiling. Wall-E is almost entirely silent for its first 40 minutes. No dialogue, no narration, no conventional storytelling scaffolding. Just a small robot on a garbage-covered Earth, making little chirping sounds and falling in love with a cleaning drone. A studio executive at any other company would have had a heart attack in the pitch meeting. Pixar greenlit it. Budget was $180 million. Worldwide gross, $533 million. 6 Oscar nominations. 1 Best Animated Feature. Then, Up opens with a 5-minute montage that summarizes an entire human life, including love, loss, and grief, without a single line of dialogue. It made grown adults weep in theaters before the actual story even started. If you didn't cry during the first 5 minutes of Up, I don't know what to tell you. I'm not judging you. I'm just saying, I have questions. Budget was $175 million. Worldwide gross, $735 million. Also won Best Animated Feature. Also got nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars, which was still somewhat unusual for an animated film at the time. 2 films, 2 years, both artistically daring, both commercially dominant. This is Pixar operating at a level nobody else in animation was anywhere close to matching. Toy Story 3, 2010, the film that ended the childhoods of an entire generation, including mine. I'm fine, everything is fine. Toy Story 3 had no business being as good as it was. Threequel animated films are almost always coasting. By the third entry, you're usually watching the studio count the money rather than tell a story. Toy Story 3 is the exception that makes every other animated threequel look lazy. Andy is going to college. The toys end up in a daycare that is secretly run like a prison. There's an incinerator scene that I am not going to describe in detail, because this is a script about box office numbers, and I refuse to revisit that emotionally. You know the scene. Budget was $200 million. Domestic gross, $415 million. Worldwide, $1,063 million. The first Pixar film to cross $1 billion. The highest grossing animated film in history at the time of its release. 3 Oscar wins, including Best Animated Feature. The film also won Best Original Screenplay at the BAFTAs, which for an animated sequel is basically unheard of. Cars 2, Bravida and Monsters University, 2011 through 2013. This is where the golden age starts showing its age. Cars 2 is the one everyone points to. Budget was $200 million. Worldwide gross was $560 million, which sounds fine until you remember every other Pixar film was clearing $600 to over $1 billion. But more damaging than the numbers were the reviews. Rotten Tomatoes score of 39%. That was the lowest score in Pixar's history at the time. And it wasn't even close. Critics essentially said the studio had made a Pixar movie for the first time that felt like it was designed backwards, starting from the merchandise and working toward the story. Brave was different. $185 million budget, $538 million worldwide. Won the Oscar for Best Animated Feature. But something felt slightly off, like Pixar doing a Disney princess film instead of the other way around. It's not bad, it's genuinely good. It just didn't feel like a creative leap. Monsters University was pure nostalgia delivery. $250 million budget, $744 million worldwide. Financially, a massive success. Critically, a shrug. The problem wasn't that it was bad. The problem was that it was fine. And after Wall-E and up in Toy Story 3, fine felt like a step backwards. Inside, Out, and The Good Dinosaur, 2015. 2015 is the year Pixar released 2 films in the same calendar year for the first time in the studio's history. One of them became a masterpiece. The other became the closest thing to a genuine flop Pixar has ever produced. Inside Out. Budget was $175 million. Worldwide gross, $857 million. Won Best Animated Feature at the Oscars. Won Best Original Screenplay at the BAFTAs. Created a new language for talking about emotional complexity with children. The film imagines human emotions as characters living inside a young girl's mind, and somehow manages to make abstract concepts like core memories and personality islands feel completely tangible. Bing bong. I'm not going further than that, you know? The Good Dinosaur was in development hell for years. The original director was replaced. The story was reworked multiple times. It asks the question, what if the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs had missed and then doesn't quite know what to do with the answer? Budget was $175 million. Worldwide gross, $332 million. In the context of any other studio, that's a hit. In the context of Pixar, it was the worst performing film in the studio's history at that point. It was also the only Pixar film released the same year as another Pixar film, which meant it was always going to be compared unfavorably to Inside Out, regardless of its actual quality. Pixar kept the streak alive, but The Good Dinosaur came the closest to snapping it of anything they'd put out up to that point. Finding Dory and Cars 3, 2016 and 2017. Finding Dory opened to $135 million on its opening weekend in the United States. That is the biggest opening weekend in animated film history at that point. It didn't matter that the film was essentially a companion piece rather than a full sequel. People showed up in massive numbers out of affection for the original, and the film delivered enough heart to justify their time. Budget was $200 million. Worldwide gross $1,028 million. Another $1 billion Pixar film. Another entry in the streak. Cars 3 is a quieter story. After Cars 2 was critically savaged, the studio essentially course-corrected. They acknowledged the sequel had lost the emotional thread and tried to bring it back. Cars 3 is genuinely better than Cars 2. That's a low bar, but they cleared it. The film deals with aging, legacy, and knowing when to pass the torch, which is a surprisingly sophisticated theme for a franchise primarily known for selling toy cars to 7-year-olds. Budget was $175 million. Worldwide gross, $383 million. Kept the streak alive, but barely counted as a win by Pixar's own historical standards. Coco and Incredibles 2, 2017 and 2018. Coco almost didn't happen the way it did. In 2013, a Mexican TV production company called Televisa filed a trademark application to own the phrase Dia de los Muertos for entertainment purposes, clearly hoping to cash in on whatever Disney or Pixar was developing around the holiday. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Disney withdrew the trademark application within days. Pixar kept making the film, brought on cultural consultants, built the production around genuine research and community relationships, and released it properly in 2017. Budget was $225 million. Worldwide gross, $807 million. Won Best Animated Feature and Best Original Song at the Oscars. Became the highest-grossing film in Mexican box office history. Coco is the film that reminded people that Pixar at its best could still reach into something true about human experience and make you feel it in your chest. Then, Incredibles 2, 14 years after the original. Brad Bird came back. The budget was $200 million. The worldwide gross was $1,242 million. The biggest Pixar opening weekend in history, the highest-grossing animated film of 2018. It took everything people loved about the first film, added a decade and a half of cultural conversation about superheroes and family dynamics, and delivered exactly what the audience wanted. Sometimes that's enough. Toy Story 4 and onward, 2019 and 2020. Toy Story 4 had no reason to be good. Toy Story 3 had the perfect ending. Andy drove away. The toys found a new child. The story was over. Everyone agreed it was over. Even the people who made it agreed it was over. And then they made another one. Toy Story 4 is about Woody figuring out who he is when he's no longer needed. It introduces Forky, a plastic spork with googly eyes who experiences an existential crisis. And somehow that character is the emotional anchor of the whole film. I genuinely cannot explain how that works, but it does. Budget was $200 million. Worldwide gross, $1,073 million. Won Best Animated Feature. The streak continued. Onward is a smaller, stranger film. Two elf brothers try to bring their dead father back for one day using a magic staff. It's set in a suburban fantasy world, where magic has been replaced by electricity and convenience. Budget was $175 million. It opened on March 6, 2020. 2 weeks later, every theater in America closed because of COVID-19. Onward made just $61 million at the domestic box office before moving to Disney+. Worldwide, it made $141 million total. In any other context, that's a disaster. In the context of a global pandemic, shutting down all public gathering, it's just a casualty of circumstance. Pixar kept the streak alive, barely. Soul, Luca, and Turning Red, 2020 through 2022. These three films did not get a real theatrical release. Disney sent them directly to Disney Plus during the pandemic and its immediate aftermath. Soul went to streaming on Christmas Day 2020. Luca followed in June 2021, Turning Red in March 2022. All three received strong to excellent reviews. Soul won Best Animated Feature and Best Original Score at the Oscars. Turning Red has quietly become one of the most beloved Pixar films of the decade among audiences under 30. Luca is a gentle, sun-warmed film about friendship and belonging that deserved a full theatrical experience. None of them have publicly reported traditional box office numbers because they were streaming releases, which means technically they're outside the scope of the streak in a conventional sense. But they're also the clearest sign of how strained the relationship between Pixar and its parent company had become. Filmmakers at the studio were furious. They'd made theatrical films that were being treated as Disney Plus programming filler. The creative frustration was real, and it showed up in industry reporting throughout this period. Pixar's identity had always been built around the theatrical experience. The theatrical window is where the stakes live. Sending films straight to streaming during this period wasn't just a business decision. It was a statement about how Disney valued, or didn't value, the theatrical Pixar brand. Lightyear and Elemental, 2022 and 2023. Lightyear finally got a full theatrical release in June 2022, and it stumbled hard. The film frames itself as the in-universe movie that inspired the Buzz Lightyear toy in Toy Story, which is a clever enough concept, but a genuinely confusing marketing hook when you're trying to sell it to general audiences who just want to know if they'll enjoy sitting in a theater for 100 minutes. Budget was $200 million. Domestic gross, $118 million. Worldwide, $226 million. That's the worst theatrical performance in Pixar history by a significant margin. The streak technically survived because the film was profitable when you factor in streaming revenue and ancillary income, but nobody was celebrating. Lightyear came as close to breaking the streak as anything Pixar had ever released. Then, Elemental, June 2023. A film about a world where elemental beings, fire, water, earth, air, live together in a city that serves as an obvious immigrant community metaphor. Budget was $200 million. Opening weekend was $29 million. The lowest Pixar opening ever. Industry tracking had projected $45 million. Headlines appeared immediately about Pixar's decline, Pixar's crisis, the end of the streak. And then something strange happened. Elemental didn't die. It held in theaters. Week 2, it dropped only about 30%, which for a struggling animated film is almost unheard of. Word of mouth was exceptional. Families kept going back. By the end of its run, Elemental had made $496 million worldwide. Still the studio's lowest grossing film in years, but not a loss. The streak survived again, and Elemental ended up being one of the most emotionally resonant Pixar films in the studio's recent history, which makes the rocky opening even more baffling in retrospect. Inside Out 2, 2024, Pixar needed a win. A real one. Not a survived a pandemic win or a word-of-mouth saved it win. A cultural event win. Inside Out 2 delivered. Anxiety joins the cast as a new emotion taking over from joy as the lead character during adolescence. The premise is almost uncomfortably well-timed. Post-pandemic mental health conversations were everywhere. The film landed in that cultural moment with precision that felt either brilliantly calculated or extraordinarily lucky. Probably both. Budget was $200 million. Worldwide gross, $1,698 million. The highest grossing animated film of 2024. The highest grossing Pixar film since Incredibles 2. And the proof that the audience hadn't gone anywhere. They'd just been waiting for Pixar to give them something worth showing up for. The full picture, 27 films, 30 years, not a single genuine box office loss. That streak is more remarkable when you understand what surrounds it. DreamWorks Animation, Pixar's closest rival for much of this period, had Spirit, Sinbad, and a string of expensive underperformers that nearly sank the studio multiple times. Disney Animation itself, the parent company, spent a significant portion of the 2000s releasing films that barely made back their budgets. Sony Animation released the Emoji Movie. I don't need to say anything else about that. Pixar's streak survived a late-stage production collapse on Toy Story 2. It survived the critical disaster of Cars 2. It survived The Good Dinosaur, which cost as much as Inside Out and made less than half as much. It survived a global pandemic. It survived being sidelined by Disney as streaming content for 3 consecutive films. It survived the lowest Pixar opening weekend ever with Elemental. And the reason it survived all of that isn't primarily financial engineering or marketing strategy, although both of those matter. The reason is that Pixar built a brand so strong, so associated with genuine emotional quality, that audiences were willing to show up even when the films themselves were uncertain. The trust built by Toy Story and Wall-E and Up and Coco is real money. It showed up in Elemental's second weekend, when families went back for a film they'd heard was better than the reviews suggested. It showed up in Inside Out 2's opening weekend, when $1.5 billion worth of tickets were purchased by people who hadn't been that excited about a Pixar film in years. 27 films. 0 flops. One streak that is bent without breaking through circumstances that would have finished almost any other studio in the business. Whether they can keep it going into the next 30 years is a genuinely open question. The streaming detour cost them something real in terms of brand equity and theatrical identity. Lightyear suggests that not every Pixar concept is automatically a theatrical event. The pressure from Disney to deliver Disney Plus content rather than theatrical releases hasn't disappeared, it's just paused. But for now, the number stands. 27 films, nearly 3 decades, and not a single one of them actually lost money. That's not luck. That's not coincidence. That's something Pixar built deliberately, film by film, story by story. From a $30 million gamble about talking toys in 1995 to a $1.7 billion cultural event about anxiety in 2024. If another studio figures out how they did it, they'll let us know. So far, nobody has.